Mount Everest isn't just the roof of the world, it's a silent graveyard where ambition, adrenaline, and danger collide. Every season, climbers from around the globe push their bodies to the limit for a chance to touch the summit, but many never come back down. Their bodies remain scattered across the mountain, frozen where they fell, unchanged by time and watched by those who dare to follow. And while every Everest death is tragic, some are so strange, unsettling, or downright shocking that they still haunt climbers decades later. In this video, we're uncovering 5 of the most disturbing and unforgettable deaths on Mount Everest stories that will chill you long after they're over.
The year was 1933, and Maurice Wilson was a man with a mission. Believing that he had a duty to impart to humanity his message of physical healing through spiritual meditation and fasting,
Maurice Wilson's story doesn't begin like a typical Everest tragedy. It unravels like a mix of blind faith, wartime trauma, and a reckless dream that spiraled into one of the strangest deaths the mountain has ever witnessed. Born into a comfortable life in Bradford, he should have inherited his family's wool business, but the First World War changed him forever. Wilson went to France at just 18, fought brutally on the front lines, won the Military Cross for standing alone against a German assault, and then came home broken, physically, mentally, and spiritually. He wandered the world for years afterward, chasing peace he could never hold on to, coughing through old wounds and sinking deeper into a loneliness that no money or travel could fix. Then, in 1932, everything shifted. After a mysterious ritual of prayer and extreme fasting, taught, he claimed, by an unnamed healer no one else ever met, Wilson felt reborn. The sickness vanished. His belief in God and the power of fasting became absolute. He became convinced he had been chosen for something bigger, something divine, and that mission, in his mind, was Mount Everest. Wilson didn't just want to climb Everest. He believed he would reach the summit to prove his spiritual method could cure the world. It didn't matter that he had never climbed a real mountain, or that he barely knew how to fly. He bought a tiny de Havilland Moth airplane, named it Everest, learned to fly with great difficulty, and began telling everyone he'd either stand on the summit or die trying. Even when he crashed the plane during practice, even when the British Air Ministry banned him from flying, even when friends begged him to stop, nothing shook his obsession, and somehow, through sheer stubbornness, he pulled off the impossible. He flew across continents, dodged authorities, lied his way past fuel bans, and landed in India with just enough fuel left to roll onto the strip. It was the first miracle of his doomed mission. When the government confiscated his plane, Wilson simply changed tactics. He slipped into Darjeeling, met 3 Sherpas willing to help him, disguised himself as a mute monk, and illegally entered Tibet on foot. By April 1934, he stood at the base of Everest, alone, completely untrained, carrying barely any equipment, and yet absolutely certain that God and fasting would lead him to the top. What unfolded from that moment reads like a mixture of courage, delusion, and heartbreaking naivety. Wilson stumbled across the Rongbuk Glacier with no glacier training, constantly losing his way. He found a pair of crampons and threw them aside. He believed footprints cut the year before would still be there. He believed the mountain would simply open the path for him. Each attempt pushed him closer to physical collapse. Snowblind, starving, limping from old wounds, he kept forcing himself higher. The Sherpas begged him to turn back. He refused. In one of his last diary entries he wrote, "This will be a last effort, and I feel successful." That was the kind of unshakable conviction that made his journey inspiring and fatal. On May 31st, 1934, he made his final entry. Off again, gorgeous day. No one knows what happened after that. The Sherpas left when he didn't return. A year later, in 1935, an expedition found his body at the foot of the North Col, lying beside the shredded remains of his tent. He had alone, likely from exhaustion or starvation, just yards from where help could have been.
It was April 29th, 2001. Babu Chiri Sherpa walked out of his tent at 21,300 feet to make some tea.
On Everest, legends are supposed to be untouchable, immune to mistakes, protected by experience. If anyone knew the mountain's moods, its traps, its silent dangers, it was Babu Chiri Sherpa. 10 successful summits, records that still stand decades later. A man who once slept on the summit of the world for 21 hours without oxygen, smiling into the thin air like it belonged to him. And yet, Everest doesn't care who you are. On April 29, 2001, Babu Chiri was not fighting a storm, a summit push, or the death zone. He was near Camp 2 in the western Siffredi, an area climbers often describe as deceptively safe. The sun reflected off fresh snow. The terrain looked calm, familiar. He stepped out of camp to take photographs, doing something he had done countless times before over nearly 2 decades on the mountain. Then the ground disappeared. A thin layer of new snow had masked a crevasse beneath his feet, one of Everest's quietest killers. No warning, no crack, no time to react. In a single misstep, the mountain swallowed one of its greatest masters. He fell roughly 30 feet into the ice, vanishing into the glacier he had crossed safely hundreds of times before. When he didn't return to camp, people knew immediately something was wrong. Searchers followed his footprints until they ended abruptly at the edge of nothing. Hours later, fellow climbers rappelled into the crevasse and found him below. Even Everest's strongest had no defense against a hidden void. He was 35 years old. What makes Babu Chiri's death so haunting isn't recklessness or arrogance. It's the opposite. He wasn't pushing limits that day. He wasn't racing the clock or ignoring weather warnings. He was simply walking on familiar ground on his own mountain. Babu Chiri's life reads like myth. Born in a remote Sherpa village with no school, he taught himself to read. He started as a porter, hauling crushing loads for pennies, learning ice and rope work on the job. By his 20s, he was out climbing nearly everyone around him. He summited Everest without oxygen again and again. He climbed faster than anyone thought possible. He stayed higher, longer, stronger. Western climbers leaned on his strength, often without fully understanding how extraordinary he was. But his dreams went far beyond records. He wanted schools. He wanted education for children who grew up like he did, brilliant, capable, but forgotten. He used his earnings to build classrooms in his home village. He spoke openly about protecting the environment and improving the lives of Sherpas who risked everything while the world celebrated others. That's what makes his death feel so cruel. After surviving avalanches, storms, exhaustion, and the thin air where most people collapse within minutes, Babu Chiri Sherpa was taken by something invisible. A reminder that on Everest, danger doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides under fresh snow. Sometimes it waits until you stop fighting and simply take a step. Today, his name lives on in memorials, schools, and records that still haven't been broken. But his story carries a darker truth, one Everest has proven again and again. Experience does not grant immunity. Strength does not guarantee safety. And even the greatest climbers in history are only ever one step away from the mountain reminding them who's really in control.
On May 19, 2012, after 16 grueling hours of climbing, Shriya Shah-Klorfine, an inexperienced climber from Canada, finally reached the summit of Mount Everest.
Shriya Shah-Klorfine's story is one of the most haunting tragedies ever to unfold on Mount Everest. Not just because she died, but how she died, and how many people believe it never should have happened. Born in Kathmandu, raised in Mumbai, and eventually building a life in Toronto, Shriya grew up with Everest in her imagination. At 9 years old, she took a helicopter tour with her father, staring at the white giant from the sky, and something inside her clicked. Decades later, that childhood moment would become the dream she chased, no matter the cost. By 2012, she wasn't a professional climber, not even close. She worked as a fashion buyer, ran a small business, campaigned in local politics, and lived a comfortable suburban life with her husband Bruce. But Everest was the goal, her ultimate symbol of success. She poured everything into it. She fundraised, created a website, even took a second mortgage on her home. Nearly $100,000 went into this one attempt, driven by pure determination and a belief that passion alone could carry her to the top of the world. But Mount Everest doesn't care about dreams. It only respects experience. Shriya booked her climb with an inexperienced guiding company. Cheap, new, untested. Climbers later said she struggled on the mountain from the very beginning. Guides warned her she was slow, unfit for the pace, and burning oxygen too quickly. On summit day, they even told her not to go, but she insisted. This was her shot, the moment she had worked years for, mortgaged her home for, surrendered her life savings for. So she pushed forward into one of the deadliest seasons Everest had seen since 1996. That day, the route was jammed with climbers stuck in bottlenecks. Hours were lost standing still in the death zone, where your body is actively dying with every minute. Still, Shriya kept climbing, battling exhaustion, the cold, the thin air, and her own limits. Somehow, unbelievably, she reached the summit. She did it. Her dream had come true, but the mountain was about to demand its price. On the descent, her oxygen ran low. Her pace collapsed. Her strength disappeared. Other climbers described her moving like she was already half gone. Just 250 meters, an 820-foot stretch from Camp 4, Shriya fell. Her body was still clipped to the rope when climber Leanne Shuttleworth passed her the next day. Climbers had to step over her to survive their own descent. It took 10 days before her body could be recovered from above 8,000 meters, the zone where even rescue teams risk death with every breath. Shriya's death became a symbol of ambition pushed too far, of inexperienced climbers thrown into a commercialized Everest, and of a guiding company that should never have taken her that high. Some call her death tragic, others call it avoidable, but everyone agrees it is a brutal reminder. On Everest, one wrong decision can cost you everything, and Shriya paid with her life.
On May 10, 1996, Mount Everest was hit by the deadliest storm ever, trapping people in what's known as the death zone.
By the time the climbers left Camp 4 just after midnight on May 10, 1996, Everest looked calm and almost welcoming. The wind was manageable. The sky was clear. Headlamps flickered like a slow-moving constellation as dozens of people began the final push toward the top of the world. For many, this was the moment they had spent years and tens of thousands of dollars dreaming about. Few of them realized they were already racing a clock they could no longer see. From the very start, things went wrong. Fixed ropes that were supposed to be in place weren't there. At the balcony, and again at the Hillary Step, climbers stacked up in long, oxygen-draining lines, forced to wait while guides hurriedly installed ropes at nearly 29,000 feet. Every minute lost meant strength slipping away, fingers numbing, and oxygen gauges quietly ticking toward empty. Still, people kept going. Turning back so close to the summit felt unthinkable. By early afternoon, the mountain began to change its mood. Snow started falling. Visibility dropped. The famous Everest illusion set in the summit looked just within reach, even though time was already running out. The agreed-upon turnaround time of 2 p.m. passed, then 3 p.m., then later still. Climbers continued upward anyway, driven by exhaustion, ambition, and the belief that they could outrun whatever was coming. They couldn't. As the last climbers stood on the summit, the storm finally arrived in full. Winds screamed across the ridge. Snow erased the route they had just climbed. Fixed ropes vanished beneath ice. The descent, always the most dangerous part, turned into a white, featureless nightmare. People began to disappear into the storm, separated from teammates by just a few steps they could no longer see. Some never made it back to Camp 4, even though it was heartbreakingly close. Guides and clients stumbled blindly across the South Col, lost in a blizzard so intense it wiped out all sense of direction. Oxygen ran low. Radios failed. Bodies shut down one system at a time. At nearly 26,000 feet, climbers collapsed where they stood, too weak to move, too hypoxic to understand they were dying. A small group huddled together in the snow, unknowingly sitting just yards from a deadly drop-off, waiting through the night as temperatures plunged and the wind refused to stop. Somehow, a few survived, others didn't. Rob Hall, one of the most respected guides on the mountain, was stranded high above, frostbitten and alone, calmly radioing base camp as his strength faded. Scott Fisher, a legendary climber known for his toughness, collapsed below the south summit, his body slowly giving out in the storm. Yasuko Namba, who had just become the oldest woman to summit Everest, froze to death within sight of safety. Doug Hansen and Andy Harris vanished into the mountain, never to be found. When the storm finally loosened its grip, the mountain was littered with the aftermath. Abandoned packs, empty oxygen bottles, and bodies left exactly where they fell. 8 climbers died over 2 days. Across the entire season, 12 would lose their lives. The tragedy shocked the world, not just because of the deaths, but because of what it revealed. Crowded routes, missed warnings, leaders pushing past safe limits, clients climbing into the death zone who had no business being there without constant support. Everest hadn't changed, but the way humans approached it had. The 1996 disaster became a turning point, exposing how thin the margin truly is between triumph and catastrophe at 29,000 feet. On Everest, success doesn't care how experienced you are, how famous your guide is, or how close the summit looks. When the mountain decides your time is up, it doesn't argue. It simply waits, and then it takes. Marco Siffredi's story reads like a legend and ends like a ghost story. He was born in Chamonix, practically raised in the shadow of mountains, in a family where climbing wasn't a hobby. It was destiny. His father was a mountain guide. His brother died in an avalanche. For Marco, danger was never a warning. It was an invitation. By his teens, he had already carved his name into the steep faces of the Alps with impossible snowboard descents. Peru, Bolivia, the Himalayas, everywhere he went, he chased the line no one else dared to ride. And Everest was his ultimate prize. In 2001, he reached the summit and snowboarded down the Norton Couloir, becoming the first person in history to ride Everest from the top. But to Marco, that wasn't enough. His dream, the one he called the Holy Grail, was the Hornbein Couloir, a death drop chute slicing down the north face, steeper, narrower, darker, and almost never holding enough snow to attempt. That year, the Hornbein was bare, so Marco promised himself he'd come back, and in 2002 he did. Late in the season, exhausted, underfed, and pushing his body beyond its limits, he returned to Everest. Even the Sherpas thought the timing was madness. Yet Marco believed the late-season storms might finally coat the Hornbein in enough snow for the descent that obsessed him. On September 8th, after a brutal 13-hour climb, he reached the summit again, but something was off. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't smiling. He muttered, "Tired. Too much climbing." The weather was turning. Clouds were creeping in. The Sherpas begged him not to go. They warned him the conditions were wrong, the descent too late, the risk too high. But Marco had chased this dream too far to stop now. Around 3 p.m., he strapped on his snowboard and slid toward the mouth of the Hornbein Couloir into a wall of moving clouds. It was the last clear moment anyone ever had of him. The Sherpas watched him disappear into the gray. Sometimes they caught glimpses of a tiny figure far below, and then, somewhere near the North Pole, 300 meters beneath Camp 3, they saw something chilling, a distant silhouette, standing, pausing, before sliding silently out of sight. No sound, no tracks, no trace. By the time they reached the spot, the snow was smooth. Marco's tracks had vanished. His body was gone. Everest had taken him, swallowed him whole. To this day, no one knows what happened in those final minutes, whether it was a fall, an avalanche, or something else entirely. All that remains is the legend of the man who dared to ride the most dangerous line on Earth and never came back.
On the chute of the West Ridge and completely obliterate Camp 1 and 2. When I say obliterate, I quite literally mean that. There was nearly nothing left. No bodies, no tents, or supplies. Nothing. Unfortunately, Gerard and 5 of the 6 Sherpas that were with him would all be killed, and they would never be seen again.
September 9th, 1974, was supposed to be the moment everything finally came together. After weeks of waiting out relentless monsoon storms, the French team believed Everest had finally opened a narrow window for them. The sky had cleared just enough to spark hope. Winds eased. Visibility returned. Camps were stocked. Ropes were fixed. For the first time in days, the mountain looked almost inviting. The dream felt close, dangerously close. They weren't just trying to reach the summit. They were attempting something bolder, a never-before-climbed direct line up the West Ridge, a route meant to bypass the chaos and constant danger of the Khumbu icefall below, a cleaner line, a smarter line, a line that would make history. But Everest was already loaded like a gun. For days, heavy rain followed by thick snowfall had layered instability across the western face. The mountain had been absorbing weight, quietly stacking danger on top of danger. Seracs loomed overhead, towering blocks of ice the size of buildings, silent, unmoving, and deceptive. Fresh powder clung to ancient ice that never truly bonded. Every step forward came with a question no one wanted to ask out loud. How long before this lets go? Everyone on the route knew it was risky. Experienced climbers always do. They just didn't know how little time they had left. That evening, as darkness settled in around 7:10 p.m., the mountain made its decision. Without warning, a massive avalanche broke loose above 7,000 meters. There was no gradual buildup, no second chance. What followed wasn't just a slide. It was a violent, explosive roar, a wall of ice and snow accelerating downhill with unstoppable force. The sound alone was described as deafening, like the mountain tearing itself apart. In seconds, Camps 1 and 2 were erased, not damaged, not partially buried, erased. Tents vanished as if they had never existed. Supplies disappeared. Ropes snapped. Men, inside their shelters, never had a chance to react. No time to unzip a tent, no time to grab boots, no time to run. The avalanche slammed through the camps and hurled bodies and equipment into crevasses beneath tons of moving snow. Gérard Devoisseau, the expedition leader and one of Chamonix's most respected mountain guides, was caught at Camp 2. He was known for his calm judgment and technical brilliance, exactly the kind of man others trusted with their lives. Alongside him were Sherpas Pemba Dorje, Nawang Lutuk, Hakpa, and Sanu Wangal. Down at Camp Waik, Nima Wangchu was also buried. 6 lives ended almost instantly. By the time the mountain fell silent again, Everest's death toll had climbed to 36. Higher up, Claude Anstey survived, isolated at Camp 3, alone above the destruction. At first, he didn't understand what had happened. The radio was quiet. The lights below were gone. The camps that should have been there simply weren't. At base camp, climbers heard the distant thunder roll through the valley. It echoed unnaturally long, bouncing off the surrounding walls. They knew something was wrong before the radio crackled with broken, shaking voices confirming the worst. No rescue was possible. Night had fallen. The slopes were unstable. Aftershocks of snow continued to move. Anyone attempting to climb into the debris field would have been risking the same fate. Only one body was ever found. The rest were never recovered. They remained somewhere inside Everest, entombed in ice, folded into crevasses, slowly becoming part of the mountain itself. The expedition ended the next morning. There was no summit push, no recovery mission, no heroic final effort. Just stunned climbers dismantling what remained of camp beneath a mountain that had made its point painfully clear. The West Ridge Direct, once imagined as a safer, more elegant alternative to the deadly Khumbu icefall, revealed itself as a different kind of killer, quieter, less traveled, just as unforgiving. What makes this tragedy linger isn't just the avalanche itself, it's the timing, the optimism, the belief that a brief pause in bad weather meant the danger had passed. Everest didn't need a mistake that day. It didn't need recklessness or arrogance. It only needed patience. And when the mountain finally moved, it delivered a brutal reminder that on Everest, ambition means nothing when gravity decides otherwise.
Near the summit of Mount Everest, up in the death zone, on the edge of the north face, there's a cave the climbers call Old Green Boot.
David Sharp's story is one of the most haunting tragedies ever to unfold on Mount Everest because of something far colder. Silence. The kind of silence that comes when dozens of people walk past a dying man and keep climbing. Sharp wasn't a reckless amateur. He was strong, skilled, and fiercely independent. He had climbed Cho Oyu, trekked across continents, and built a reputation for being calm, friendly, and incredibly resilient. He had a degree in mechanical engineering, a solid career, and plans to start teaching later that year. Everest wasn't meant to be his last mountain. It was supposed to be the accomplishment he carried into the next chapter of his life. But Sharp believed something many climbers quietly believe, that using oxygen, guides, and heavy support takes away from the purity of the climb. He wanted Everest on his own terms. No Sherpa partner, no hand-holding, no radio, and barely any oxygen. Just his skill, his willpower, and the mountain itself. That choice, combined with the brutal reality of Everest's north side, sealed his fate. He reached Advanced Base Camp with only the bare minimum provided by a basic services package. Gear transport, food, a permit, and a tent. Everything above that point was up to him. He moved through the camps alone, set his own pace, and carried only 2 oxygen bottles, a fraction of what most climbers bring. On the night of May 13, 2006, David Sharp started his summit push. Climbers spotted him ascending through the darkness, moving slowly but determined. Whether he reached the summit or turned back just below it, no one knows. What is known is this: he began descending far too late, exhausted, frostbitten, and dangerously low on oxygen. By nightfall, he'd collapsed in a cramped rock alcove near 8,500 meters, Green Boots Cave, the most infamous landmark on Everest, where another climber's frozen body had already served as a silent marker for years. Sharp wedged himself beside that body and curled into a ball, arms wrapped around his legs, alone in temperatures that plunged far below freezing. He had no radio, no partner, no one waiting for him in a nearby tent, no one expecting him at a specific hour. He simply disappeared into the mountain's death zone. Through the early morning hours, climbers began passing him. Some saw him move slightly, some heard faint sounds. Others assumed he was already gone. At that altitude, where every breath burns and every step drains precious oxygen, stopping for too long can kill the rescuer. Most believed they couldn't save him. Some tried giving oxygen, shaking him, urging him to stand, but he was far beyond the point where willpower could bring him back. One climber later said he was still alive, but he wasn't there anymore. All day, climbers pushed past him, dozens on their way to the summit and dozens returning. It was one of the busiest summit days of 2006, and among all that movement, David Sharp slowly faded. When he didn't return to camp that night, people assumed he had simply bivouacked somewhere high, a dangerous but not unheard of choice among solo climbers. Hours later, word spread that someone had seen him sitting motionless in Green Boots Cave. By then, it was far too late. When David Sharp died, his body sat upright against the rock, beside Green Boots, frozen mid-embrace of his own legs, alone within sight of hundreds of climbers. Sharp's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a mirror held up to the climbing world. A reminder that the death zone doesn't just strip oxygen, it strips judgment, warmth, humanity. And the mountain doesn't care who you are, an engineer, a teacher, a dreamer, or a seasoned climber. Up there, alone at 8,500 meters, everyone is fragile. Everyone is mortal. The summit had already been won. The flags had been planted. History, once again, had been honored. And yet this was the moment Mount Everest was waiting for. On May 10, 1993, Lopsang Tshering Bhutia stood on the roof of the world, following a path his family name had etched into history 40 years earlier. He was the nephew of Tshering Norgay, the man who first conquered Everest alongside Sir Edmund Hillary in 1953, and this climb was never just another expedition. It was a tribute, a symbolic return, a living continuation of a legacy the entire mountaineering world revered. For Lopsang, Everest was familiar ground. He wasn't a tourist chasing a headline. He was a seasoned instructor at the Himalayan Mountaineering Institute, a man who had trained others to survive these heights. He had carried loads through storms, fixed ropes where mistakes meant death, and climbed without oxygen when others couldn't stand. If anyone belonged up there, it was him, and that's what makes what happened next so haunting. Because Everest didn't kill him on the way up. The descent began like so many others. Slow, exhausting, brutal. Every step down from the summit felt heavier than the last. Oxygen was running low. Muscles were hollowed out by altitude, The brain, starved of air, started making quiet, deadly mistakes. This is the phase climbers fear most, though few admit it out loud. The mountain doesn't celebrate your success. It waits until you turn your back. Somewhere high on the southeast ridge, roughly 200 meters above Camp 4, Lopsang drifted just slightly off the fixed ropes. It wasn't dramatic, no avalanche, no collapse of ice, just a step too far in terrain that forgives nothing. Exhaustion and hypoxia blurred the margin between solid ground and empty space. Then he was gone. Those nearby never heard a scream, only the sickening realization that one of the strongest climbers on the mountain had vanished. His body was later found curled in a gully, head injuries confirming what Everest had claimed in seconds. The watch on his wrist had stopped mid-afternoon, freezing time at the exact moment legacy met gravity. The irony was unbearable. This was the 40th anniversary expedition meant to celebrate survival, endurance, and triumph. Instead, it became a brutal reminder of Everest's oldest rule. The summit is optional, but the descent is mandatory. Lopsang, Tshering, Bhutia had done everything right. He had the bloodline, the training, the experience, the respect of the mountain. And still, Everest took him after he had already won. That's what makes his death linger in your mind. Not because he failed, but because he didn't. He reached the top of the world, and Everest waited patiently for him to come back down. Doug Hansen wasn't a famous climber or a record chaser. He was a quiet, hard-working postal worker from Washington, a man who ran marathons, climbed mountains on weekends, and carried a simple dream: to stand on the summit of Everest. It was the one goal he refused to let go of. He'd tried once before in 1995 and had been forced to turn back just a few hundred feet from the top. That unfinished business burned inside him for an entire year. So, in 1996, he came back. Friends said he looked tired even before the climb began. Some climbers at base camp noticed he had frostbite injuries from the previous year. He was recovering from a small throat surgery. He wasn't in perfect shape, but Everest has a cruel way of feeding hope. Doug faxed his kids often from base camp, telling them he was going to give it everything he had, and he meant it. On May 9th, just before midnight, he started his summit push with Rob Hall's Adventure Consultants team. Other climbers doubted he could keep up. At one point during the climb, someone overheard him say he was cold and wanted to go back, but he didn't. Whether from determination or a desperate need to finish what he started, Doug pushed on, step after agonizing step toward the top of the world. He climbed long past the turnaround time the moment every mountaineer knows is life or death. Most of the team had already abandoned their summit attempt and turned around, but Doug kept going. Witnesses later said he looked exhausted, barely lifting his feet, laces dragging behind him. Still, he pushed forward. Still, Rob Hall stayed with him. Hours later, Doug reached the summit at around 4:30 p.m., the last climber of the day to get there. The wind was rising. The sky was darkening, and the blizzard that would become one of Everest's deadliest storms in history was already building around them. On the descent, everything fell apart. Doug ran out of oxygen near the Hillary Step. Rob radioed base camp saying Doug was weak, unable to move without help, and that the situation was very serious. Other guides begged Hall to leave Doug and save himself. Hall refused. "We're both listening," he told base camp, his voice tired but steady. Somewhere in the chaos of the storm, Doug Hansen collapsed and never got back up. At dawn, Rob Hall made one final radio call. When asked where Doug was, he gave a haunting reply: "Doug is gone." And he never explained what happened next. Rob died later that day, still clipped to the mountain, still refusing to leave his client behind. Doug's body was never found. Years later, climbers pieced together fragments of what happened: late decisions, summit fever, human pressure, and a storm no one could have outrun. His death became one of the most debated parts of the 1996 Everest disaster. Was he a victim of bad judgment? Was he pushed too hard? Or was he simply a man who believed in his dream more than he feared the cost? What remains is the heartbreak. A father who wanted to inspire his kids by reaching the top of the world and lost his life chasing it. On the morning of April 25, 2015, Everest Base Camp was alive in the way it always is during climbing season. tents flapping lightly in the cold air, climbers resting, laughing, checking gear, sending messages home. For many, this was the calm before their summit push. The most dangerous part of the climb, the Khumbu icefall, was still ahead, but base camp felt safe. It always does. Then, just before noon, the ground itself betrayed them. At first, people thought it was vertigo. The earth began to roll, not shake slow, sickening waves moving beneath their boots. Cooking pots rattled. Ice walls groaned. Climbers dropped to their knees as Everest Base Camp, sitting on a frozen glacier, started to move like water. This wasn't a storm. This wasn't an avalanche. This was an earthquake. 200 kilometers away, Nepal had just been struck by a 7.8 magnitude seismic monster, and Everest felt every second of it. Within moments, a deep roar echoed through the western CWM low, thunderous, growing impossibly loud. Climbers looked up just in time to see it. High above base camp, a massive slab of snow and ice broke loose from the flanks of Pumori. What followed wasn't a slide. It was a wall of destruction, accelerating straight toward the heart of base camp. There was nowhere to run. The avalanche slammed into the camp with hurricane force, blasting tents off the glacier like paper, burying people in seconds, hurling bodies and equipment across the ice. Some climbers were thrown dozens of meters. Others were crushed where they stood. The air turned white, then silent, except for screams, alarms, and the terrifying sound of people digging with bare hands. When it was over, base camp no longer looked like base camp. It looked erased. At least 22 people were dead within hours. By the end, the number climbed to 24, making it the deadliest single day in Everest's history. Sherpas, expedition leaders, seasoned climbers, first-timers' experience meant nothing. One moment they were alive, planning dinner or a summit window. The next, they were gone. Above them, the nightmare wasn't over. The earthquake had triggered multiple avalanches across the mountain. Ladders in the Khumbu icefall were ripped away. Routes vanished. Camps higher up were cut off completely. More than 100 climbers were stranded above base camp with no safe way down, watching avalanches continue to thunder through the icefall below them. Helicopters fought thin air and brutal weather the next morning, lifting the wounded out in waves. Dozens were injured. Broken spines, crushed limbs, traumatic brain injuries. Some didn't survive the flight to medical aid. Others waited days, watching supplies dwindle while aftershocks rattled the mountain again and again. Survivors later described the scene in haunting terms, like a war zone, like a nuclear blast, total desolation, and perhaps the most chilling truth of all. Everest hadn't done anything climbers normally fear. No storm, no misstep, no bad decision. The danger came from far beyond the mountain, from the earth itself. Something no rope, no skill, no experience could protect against. The 2015 climbing season never recovered. For the first time in 41 years, not a single person reached Everest's summit in the spring. The mountain stood untouched not because it was unconquerable, but because it had already taken enough. On that day, Everest didn't need altitude or ice to kill. It simply waited and let the world beneath it break.